our Commerce Reimagined series. We're highlighting change makers, visionaries, and the people who are changing the way that we're defining innovation in this ever-changing world. And boy, is it changing. So I'm very excited to welcome Ben Royce, who leads the AI solutions for the agency team at Google. He was department head of search and data science at Publicis North America, inventor of Publicis Caffeine, and co-inventor of Sapient Content Topography, and is currently a part-time lecturer at Columbia University. His research has been cited in Think with Google, Forrester Research, and mentioned at What's Working by Mintel Research. His specialties also include search, mobile technology, data science, digital strategy, information science, consumer insight, and behavioral research. Obviously a man with plenty of free time on his hands because he's not, doing a lot of stuff during his day job. Ben, thank you very much for joining us. It's good to have you here.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I want to kick off with asking you, obviously a contextual question about the pandemic before we move into a little bit more about, mobile technology and data. But we're seeing an unprecedented change in the way companies are using data, and they're racing to innovate their companies, and they're trying to adapt to this whole situation now. So data and translation couldn't be more important to them. And we can see that as their priorities, but we can also see it in terms of when you look at budgets and resources, that's where it's going right now. So what are you seeing as the biggest ways companies and consumers are using data that they weren't looking at or they weren't using just 3 to 4 months ago?
Yeah, so the trends that I'm seeing, we all know that working from home has essentially moved a lot of workers, at least in a corporate that worked in an office, they're working from home and they're adjusting their behaviors, right? So we're seeing lots of things on the consumer side too that are like virtual weddings, virtual graduations. The timing of this, at least in the US for graduation is, I feel bad for some students that have to go through a virtual graduation, but it's not quite the same as walking across the platform. But the usage of data, now we, for example, know how much people are logging online because their job is entirely digital. So I think that's interesting to see, like when people are, typing, when people are using their email, when people are using video chat, and you have this sort of like constant always on, and it's actually exhausting for a lot of people. There's a bit of research that shows that for some reason digital interactions, while are getting closer and closer to real, they're not there yet, but they're getting closer and closer, are exhausting because you have to pay attention in a different way, and all those little micro signals between people aren't being picked up. So we're trying to figure out what are the ways those micro signals can be kind of sent over in a digital environment. That data isn't there yet, and I think it could be, and we might start picking it up. Other things that we're noticing is like the trends around search behavior, like notifications, people turning them on and off, stuff like that, which is kind of interesting. But the big thing that I've noticed with a lot of my clients is how the prioritization has been completely turned upside down. So projects that were like slated for 2022 that were like the virtualization of something, all of a sudden were done in a matter of weeks, which is, I find fascinating, because it's like they were like, oh, it's a big project, it'll take a long time, there's a whole discovery. And magically, when forced to these digital transformations, they're all of a sudden up and running very quickly because the priorities changed, which I think is a good thing. The other thing is notice that, and we've noticed this on the Google side, I've seen this with a lot of other researchers, is that getting data faster is actually more important at this point than getting more data. So for example, the ability to say, hey, what happened in the last 3 days is critical in a pandemic, versus what, taking a week to get data, processing it, and then releasing a report a month later, right? It's that time to insight that really seems to matter at this point. And we've run into that with our systems, like as some of our, like for example, YouTube watch time is up. We were doing reports and things like that, but because of more usage, our data was getting slower on the analysis side, which is actually exactly the opposite of what we needed to happen. So the speed to data, or I call it time, reducing the time to insight, is actually important. And it's not something we usually think about. We usually think of data as like access and size. Speed is actually probably more important.
That's a really good point. When I think back to the habits and attitudes studies that we used to do, and we used to give them a timeline of usage of 4 years. So if it was you know, we're in 2020, something out of 2016 would be just becoming, you know, expired right now in terms of data when you look at the old H&As. And right now we're looking at things in terms of a month is too late. That's an amazing change, right?
Yeah, we had an example where one of our systems that we use to analyze YouTube comments. So we look at YouTube comments at massive scale, trying to figure out if there's patterns. And of course, we did this with COVID-19. Was we had a delay of a couple days if we wanted to pull, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of comments. We were just doing that to keep systems stable, but the cost of that was that we couldn't get data for 5 days. 5 days in late March or early April was the equivalent of months in terms of what the value of insight, right? Like that was like the critical time people were going into shelter in place or whatever the variant is in your state. And that was like, we had to get down to 15 minutes. That's when it became useful again. We had something that happened, and 15 minutes later, we could analyze that scale. That's when we started seeing a lot of usage of insight tools on our side. And that was because of that difference between 5 days and 15 minutes.
That's just amazing. And it shows you the speed of behavioral change that's happening as a reaction to all of this, because the speed of your data is, and the data insights that you're developing has to be proportional to the speed of the behavioral change. If the behavior isn't changing, you don't really need all of that data that quick. But because the behavior is changing so quick, it's becoming a lot more valid. So I want to build on that behavioral kind of change notion, and ask you if you're seeing any trends of changes in terms of, you know, voice, mobile technology, data analysis, consumption happening at a faster rate. Are people not only consuming it more, but are you feeling changes in behavior as well in terms of the voice technology?
Yeah. So I mean, 4 years ago, about 20% of US Android users were using voice search, right? Which is, and that was 4 years ago. It has gone up since then, no question about that. What's interesting is when it comes to voice technology and voice search, or even just using voice as a key in replacement of a keyboard, is looking at different countries. And this is where I really found the juiciest information. For example, if you look at the US and most of Western Europe, the adoption of mobile phones in general was about the same pace, right? And they kind of all got these new features around the same time. Within a few months of each other, they would get these new features added. If you look at countries that didn't have like this a high adoption rate of laptops and desktops, but then had a rapid adoption of mobile phones, you see behavioral differences. So, for example, Brazil has had an incredible story as just an economy in the last few years, but they basically had an insane adoption of mobile phone usage from 2012 to 2014, right? And that was basically, they literally leapfrogged over and went right from very little digital usage to incredibly mobile heavy usage. Like, for example, sending voice messages is much more popular in Brazil. The adoption of voice voice as a input method, whether it be search or messaging, is much, much higher in Brazil than anywhere in Western Europe or in North America. So it's when you adopted the device seems to change the behavior of what features you use. So that means, like, if you get your first phone in 2014, voice technology is pretty good. It's, you know, about 95% accurate. When you get your first, you know, smartphone in 2010, voice transcription is not as good. It's like, you know, in the low 80s in terms of accuracy. And that is a signal. Like, if 1 in 5 things don't work on your phone, you're probably not going to use it that often unless you really, really have to. If it works 95% of the time, you're much more likely to use it. It's like a, you know, exponential difference in behavior. So we see that with a number of countries where their first major device is a phone, they behave differently. And that's where voice comes in. The only other difference with voice is that, for example, we speak at a much faster rate than we'll ever type, right? There are very few people who can type as fast as they speak. And I think it's like 100, it's about the equivalent of 50 words per minute versus 150 words per minute when you speak. And that changes, for example, the length of keywords that they search for. It changes what they search for, and much more specific. When it comes to how people are using it now, the mobile adoption has accelerated even faster. One thing I was surprised that I saw some third-party research that showed that while people are staying home, yes, they're watching more Netflix. Yes, they're consuming more media because they're sitting at home is less commuting. They're not doing it on their laptops or on their desktops. They're doing it on their phones, which I thought was kind of interesting. We think of phone as out of the home a lot of times, and this is wrong. You sit on the couch with your phone just as much as you sit on the couch looking at your TV. And the primary recipient of all this media consumption is still the phone, which I was kind of surprised. I thought it would be flat and there would be a more desktop and laptop usage, but it turns out that that's not really the case.
That's a really good point. And I think it brings up also the notion of what is a native feature at time of adoption, what you were talking about with voice. And so, like when you compare it to what happened in West African countries with phone banking, where the adoption of that process made the system kind of a native use system the moment they adopted their phones. It's a matter of what feature was available working at the best point. And if we do maybe a regression study looking at what features had become native features at different points in time for different generations, we might look at how the adoption happens, and it might lead to kind of a difference in looking at the way that you launch new hardware and software, because the adoption system for the newer generation that's trying this for the first time might be a completely different usage behavior. That would be pretty interesting.
Totally. I remember in the late 90s, someone I think it was a joke, but I definitely know it happened at least once in my life, was someone described the CD-ROM tray as a cup holder. And I remember laughing at that, being like, that's so ridiculous. I'm terrified to think about what is going to be the equivalent for me, in that world. Like, what am I going to think that is not really what its intended purpose is? So yeah, when you adopt technology, if you're not used to having any computer in your life, a round shaped thing that's the size of a cup that is nearby your workstation could be a cup holder. It's not wrong. It's probably damaging to the device, but it's not necessarily a wrong assumption. So when people adopt it, and this is what really good product managers are really good at doing, is they know what the value of the feature is. They know what it's going to do, what it's going to provide to the user, but more importantly, they know how it's going to affect the behavior in the future, and which different groups, like early adopters versus late adopters, how they're going to interpret it. This is what really good product managers do, and I don't think we give that enough attention.
That's a very good point. So when we look at that, that's a really good way of looking at the type of accessible data that you have and drawing a pretty beautiful insight that's oriented more towards the behavior rather than just looking at data for the sake of the numbers. What about the flip side of this? Where do you see are the biggest gaps in available data, and how do you see that, gathering that, if there's a gap that you think that we have right now that we could, fill later, how do you feel like we would gather that? And what are some examples of data that might be readily available right now that marketers just haven't scratched the surface on or don't know exist?
Yeah, so the debate is always around data access, and that's why we've seen a number of movements in legislation to try and limit how much data is available, or at least give consent and control to the user, which is inherently a good thing. I think controlling your own data is important. That requires data literacy up front, which is a whole other issue. I think the educational community could really do some more work on that. But as we see more privacy laws coming into effect and consumers have more control over their own data, it isn't going to be an access debate. We're actually seeing a rollback of access from platforms. It could be from advertisers. It could be from those being advertised to. They're sort of reining it in a little bit. It's not going to be about access. It's going to be about the techniques used to process it. This is where the innovation is happening. So this is why data scientists, once I got familiar with the practice of data science, I saw the runway was so long. I thought there was so much value that could be done with the data that we already have. Those techniques, for example, one of my favorite ones right now is using what's called personality analytics. So the research around personality, and in the social sciences, like psychology, is basically getting very, very good for a social science. So now we can see there are linguistic patterns in people's writings that show kind of how they think or what their personality is. And we know that personality determines a lot of behavior. Not everything, but a lot of it, right? Like, for an example, I've done multiple personality studies on my own writing, and it turns out that I'm a relatively disagreeable person. I almost enjoy conflict in a lot of ways, right? And that's definitely a trait that not everyone has. That means that I tend to like things that are controversial because I'm not necessarily threatened by them. I kind of find them interesting and engaging, even if they are confrontational to me. That is something that's worth knowing about an employee. That is something that's worth knowing about someone who's going to manage people, right? And I have to know that about myself if I'm going to manage people, things like that. So and that's available in any email, any LinkedIn profile. IBM has a great API called Personality Insights. Literally give it a Twitter account or a piece of text that someone has written, and it'll give you a personality profile. This is not new data in terms of what we're putting in. It's their Twitter account. Like, they publicly posted that, or, you know, they wrote you an email, whatever. Your LinkedIn account, for example, available. It's the techniques that we use inside with that data that makes it so much more valuable. And I think people lose track. They talk about access and you've got this and you shouldn't have that. And fine, let's agree on what can be used and what can't be used. Public data should be public data. It's the techniques that get used. So another thing we can do is, for example, detect the emotionality in someone's writing. So if a customer emails someone and they're very, very angry, we've worked with some companies that will reroute their customer service emails to the customer service representative that deals best with that emotion, which is super interesting, right? So like, basically, if Mike's really good at handling angry people and Sarah's really good at handling, sad people, if the customer satisfaction goes up, why aren't we using this technology? It's nothing that they're not, if they're emailing you, they're giving you, the message, that's their data they've provided. And now you're doing a better job at handling it. So again, no need for extra data access. It's the techniques involved that make it better. And I think this is like kind of how a lot of anything this big system-wide debate happens, is we start to realize that it's getting more granular and more scientific about smaller things at scale, not just scaling up and out. So yeah, that's a couple things that I would look at, and there's a number of free services that you can try out to do that. And I think the personality stuff is fascinating. It's a goldmine for managers. It's a goldmine for anyone who's in HR, things like that. You can learn how to address issues with that person in mind, literally. It's great for advertisers. Wouldn't you want to know what is the general personality traits that are different from the general population of the audience that you're targeting? It just seems to make sense to me, and it requires no new data access.
That's a really good point. I mean, I got to say, I started out in economics, and then my graduate studies were in behavioral psychology. And after doing an economics degree, you take a look at data and you start looking at aggregated systems, and you look at how you create the models and so on. And then you finish up in psychology, and you go from the outside in of economics to the inside out of psychology, and looking at exactly the same piece of information, you extrapolate something completely different.
It's worth exploring, because I remember I took economics. I loved economics because it was in theory, it explained the behavior of almost everyone. And then we find out that not all economic theories hold true all the time, right? Like there's definitely the assumption of a lot of economics is that everyone believes in their own rational self-interest. We know this is patently not true. Like, people do things not in their best interest all the time, right? It's based on a value structure. What they value is what they rationally go towards, and values change a lot between people. So I think this is where when people get worried about how much we're focusing on data and how much we're focusing on optimization, I keep telling them, like, every time that we optimize something, the question of why keeps popping up, right? They go, why does that happen? And then it becomes a behavioral economics or a psychology question. And it turns out, oh, well, we're back to square one in terms of we have a lot of work to do. So I think it's just an advancement. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The insight that you can find from people's behavior is unbelievably interesting, and any marketer or advertiser should be interested in that. And you don't require extra data for that. That's just a different technique. Absolutely.
So I want to move into a bit of a speed round, and this one, just to make things a little extra difficult for you, we're going to be asking you for your advice to a plethora of people. So what advice do you have for companies now to stay relevant for the future? what would you tell your students is the biggest piece of advice you have for people looking to get into data science particularly? And do you think that data science is still the sexiest job of the future? Which is news to me in terms of the term sexiest for it, but maybe the most sought after job, maybe for this one. What do you think?
So for companies, look, I have a lot of clients and groups that have approached me saying they want to do artificial intelligence or machine learning. That's the wrong question. That's the wrong approach, I would argue. My advice is to say, what's your biggest problem? And then see if AI can solve it, because that's where it gets super interesting, right? So if your biggest problem is fraud, and if you're a bank or something like that, or a credit card company, fraud, yes, the artificial intelligence is wonderful at detecting fraud compared to traditional means. So I would start with the problem and then try and find the solution, starting with the, it's a cart before the horse kind of thing. So that's my advice, is start with the biggest problem and work your way down your problems until you find AI being the solution. Regarding the students, I like teaching, and if you are relatively senior in your role, I recommend looking into teaching because one, it's very rewarding, but two, it resets your perspective. I get to work with brilliant data scientists that have absolutely zero experience. And that is really, really interesting when during my day job, I work with people with decades of experience who maybe aren't that good with data, right? And I get to see both sides of it. And it's really good because it gives you perspective on how people see this stuff. But two is they are always focusing on technical skills. And I think technical skills are important, but they're a baseline for a data scientist. The best data scientists are the ones who understand a little bit of social psychology or behavioral economics and understand a lot about data scientists. And they try and get really, really good. And I tell them, like, having the sharpest sword is not the most important thing. Having a sharp sword and another one is better, right? So that kind of multi-skilled thing. And I think we don't do a good enough job making that case to students about, mixing methodologies, which in academia is usually a bad thing, but mixing methodologies in terms of having skill sets is wonderful, a wonderful thing to have, and you'll add more value instantly. And it's much more fun to be helpful more often, right? Do I still think data science is still the sexiest job of the future? Yeah, the quote was the sexiest job of the 21st century, and that was, I still think it's true because we're still producing more and more data. It's getting more complex with privacy laws and regulation, but I still think that, like, I still get that really childish excitement whenever I take something that looks boring on the surface, I use a technique of some sort and find something interesting in it. There's still a really weird joy in that. And it's like, it's kind of like, it's literally the diamond in the rough, except everyone wanted diamonds, but no one went into the rough, if you will, right? So there's still that excitement. So I genuinely tell people that's why I still do it. It's why I still get my hands dirty with data. I still do. I mean, I'm not the best data scientist, by any means. I never was, actually, but now I still get that really interesting feeling of finding something, discovering something where everyone else thought was useless or exhaust data or garbage. So yeah, I still think it's the sexiest job of the 21st century.
Well, there we go. Some really good insight and some decent advice for people that are looking for their next job, and some companies that are trying to figure out how to stay relevant. That's very helpful. So, Ben, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure catching up with you. And for anyone interested in digging deeper in this topic, I'm sure Ben would be pleased to support how we see this evolving over time, and responding maybe to a few questions to people who reach out. You can find him on LinkedIn at Ben Royce. That's BenRoyce. And if you're interested, you can find me there too, at Roy Armale. So there we go. Thank you so much for your time, Ben.
Thanks for having me.